With the advent of the abstract expressionists, art was at a crossroads, if you like, throwing off the shackles of old order. Now the content of what made up a piece of art was a relatively free choice, a freedom though bound up in the recent horrors of World War II, but in this sense and context, artists were free to make their own minds up about what to paint and how. Abstract expressionism was embraced in the US from a slightly different perspective than in devastated Europe, but still part of a world that was certainly shocked and questioning what had happened. Abstract expressionism was born on the shores of relatively unscathed US. Its immigrants from World War II Europe were lucky and they knew it. The art was abstract, no direct reference to those recent horrors, but a close look at the work of these artists showed a marked, introverted, solipsistic approach. Abstract expressionism was becoming all about the artist. However, the artists who subsequently belonged to the Abstract Artists of America, or AAA, Newman, Motherwell, de Kooning, had reason to be painting this way. America was a huge place of differing populations. From its origins as America, it had painted its recent fledgling self in the scenery of its newly discovered natural surroundings. Its European émigrés paid homage to Europe's gardens, which flourished along the east coast, in the auspice of France's impressionist Monet. De Kooning put it very succinctly: we need a common language. And Newman and the abstract expressionists, with their differing yet unmistakably abstracted processes of painting, took Cubism and all the European isms of the last few decades and breathed new life into a sophisticated art, a truly pan-American language. It was, aside from anything else, embraced as a statement for a country, a newly formed and relatively fragile nation in the wake of all the wars of the last century. It could now be seen as one, with a post-war identity through its art and culture, and most importantly, a future glimpsed through it. The Second World War had created a transatlantic now what moment for many artists, the moment of realisation after shock, as in, what do we paint? After all the destruction, the horrors in the homelands of Europe, the devastation, a question not only of how do we paint the events of what has just gone before, but also how do we paint into the future was posed. The new American continent was ripe for a boldness in change and a unity of style. Newman's work, with his zips, and Motherwell with his abstracted automated images or doodling based on surrealist technique, de Kooning still seeing a signifying woman's mouth at the centre of his increasingly abstract abstractions. The unifying thing was their belief in the meaning of their art, the idea that the abstraction was able to say something about the inner self. As Jackson Pollock famously said, with experience it seems to be possible to control the flow of paint to a great extent, and I don't use the accident because I deny the accident. It's quite different from working, say, from a still life where you set up objects and work directly from them. I do have a general notion of what I am about and what the results will be. I approach painting in the same sense as one approaches drawing, that is, it's direct. This idea was later taken further to the extent that abstract artists painted or made art born from the artist's inner vision. This not in a spiritual sense, but an essence of meaning, a language created by the artist, devoid of any obvious figurative reference to nature or subject, an aesthetic, seemingly simplified, art of specifics of depth, colour, solidity, or combinations, but capable of wider meaning and interpretation. Such as seen in later minimalism, a stripped bare aesthetic, through an intellectualized approach to making art, which for many equated to inaccessibility. It helped alienate many lay skeptics not versed in the meaning of this new art language, devoid of any figurative or even symbolic ballasts. Repetition played an important role too in the idea of early conceptual art, and Duchamp's ready-mades. He retired to a life of chess playing, absolving himself of the need to repeat. His life's work was later discovered surreptitiously made, only to be noticed after his death. However, taking art to the land outside the gallery space, still being easily defined as an art object, offered its own conundrum. Land is expensive, and so is the idea of non-commodification. Whatever the resulting idea, it was or is only ever going to lend itself to an occupation of the wealthy, or those who are able to fund it. In 1982, an artist in Chicago created an ideas piece called Watch the Doors Please. He covered the exterior double doors of 165 rail cars with vertical stripes, a continuously repeated pattern executed without composition. A window in the Art Institute of Chicago, which overlooked the tracks, served as the frame with which to view. Next to the window was a list of train times showing when they would pass. The work could only be seen in the museum when they passed. As the trains left the window viewing space, the work would be taken into a public space to be seen by many more people, potentially anonymous and public property, an idea which the artist was addressing of a private versus public collective function of art. Take a step back here and view the historical timeline we have traced through art. Right in the middle of the 20th century, with the plethora of isms and ideas in terms of approach, styles and techniques. Looking back at the artists and art we have encountered so far in the 20th century, there seems a difference emerging. Art is no longer based on a societal focus on religious belief, for example, or the fond reminisce of ancient times, as was with neoclassical Greek and Roman art, nor even the Egyptian and Byzantine mosaics and reliefs, most certainly a long way away from those handprints in the caves at Lascaux. Or is it? We can see an emergence of a reverence of a kind in that of worship of things, and the art object absorbed within a cycle of commodity. A lot of history in terms of dates. However, art history is different. It is specific to itself. It is outside of history because it does not and cannot tell accurate stories. Although artists generally over the last 1,000 years have been commissioned by those in power, and only those paintings of specific historical events tell us a story, and only then from the required perspective. Today, art sold or auctioned no longer has meaningful function in terms of helping present a unified focus like religion used to, or of medieval art, or ancient icons, gods or talismans for that matter. Now, in a relatively secular, non-religious society, one of art's new functions seems primarily to be that of investment. Since 1970s New York, with the list of savvy gallerists like Mary Boone emerging in Soho, Tribeca, and later the Lower East Side, art from the depths of To Be Seen In music clubs like Palladium, The Area, and Mud, frequented by people like Andy Warhol, Basquiat and Haring, with murals and paintings interchangeable with their walls. After the initial chaotic start, during punk's years of people like Patti Astor and Gracie Manson's Fun Gallery, the pressure not to only nurture artists but to pay the hawkish commerciality of potential rentable spaces in the city would, as the 80s continued, eventually produce art sold with spin, much like the pseudoscience that sells cars, white goods and cosmetics. Art became more questioning of pop's ironic copycat commercialism, with artists like Jeff Koons. The isms ran out around this time as so many variables of the term art started to be produced, with technology aiding that process. Film and mechanised forms of sculpture began to offer less obviously contemplatory notions of what art used to be when it was hung on walls as a painting. Now, a few decades on, art of all colours and descriptions can be seen to perform like a high-end commodity or valuable. The content or story it now tells is quite different in that it is diverse, determined by the artist, what is made and what it's worth. Art has progressed, but only within the limits of our current understanding of the world. Art has always happened alongside historical events, for sure. This is how it works. History, on the other hand, has always been documented as a progression, a story over time, at one point seen as a predetermined end goal, already written, predetermined pattern of human decisions on a predictable path. And with the help of religious doctrine, history in general being a collective memory written by those who could write and those who commandeered the writing, but also those who discovered this history through other research-based means like archaeology. A lot of this happened at the advent of the Renaissance and again during the 1800s, when the classicism and neoclassicism was revisited by historians, writers, explorers, and with inquisitive booty-fueled trips for the physical evidence. All seen through a timelined lens, events and artifacts, their meaning and relevance, commissioned, funded, written and endorsed, displayed in grandiose settings, fledgling public institutions, and sometimes hidden from view, seemingly of uninterest under the microscope of history. Bear this in mind now as we look at some 20th century artists' work and their attitudes in a little more depth. So, although art was changing after the Second World War, to view art entirely through the prism of it being in cahoots with a consumer desire for object, with a hungry market eager to manipulate that desire for profit, is not enough. Art could be seen to be changing as it always has done. It was, though, in direct relation to how society was changing at that time. Religion was no longer holding the binding glue of people's focus, in most of the Western world at least, and with that kind of void occurring, a non-belief, and as Nietzsche said, the point, without that you have nothing. Secularism, in that sense, melded with the industrialised focus on individual needs and aspirations. It has now become political ideology based on the money generated from these needs. Hence the need for advertising, projecting these perceived needs onto us. In a cynical sense, you could say art has changed accordingly, absorbed in this self-fulfilling cycle. Art was and is becoming more and more a business acumen of the self-employed, if not aspirational star.